The order came at dusk. Fall back. Every American soldier on top of Hacksaw Ridge heard it. Every single one. And every single one obeyed. They grabbed their rifles, grabbed their wounded when they could reach them, and they moved fast, desperate, toward the edge of the cliff. 400 feet straight down to something that looked like safety. 400 feet up to something that looked like a grave. Every soldier obeyed, except one. He didn't have a weapon. He had never had a weapon, not in training camp, not in Guam, not in the Philippines, and not here on this ridge on this night. He was a medic, a Seventh-day Adventist from Virginia, a man who had told the United States Army, from the very first day he put on a uniform, that he would not kill another human being. His own soldiers had tried to get him discharged. His sergeant had filed the paperwork. His commanding officer had called him a psychiatric case. One soldier had threatened to kill him before they ever reached the enemy. None of that mattered now, because when the last American soldier dropped over the edge of that cliff, Desmond Doss was still standing at the top, alone, in the dark, the Japanese army moving through the shadows all around him. He didn't pray for rescue. He didn't pray to survive. He looked around at the broken, bleeding shapes of men lying on that plateau. Men who had cursed his name, thrown boots at him while he slept, and tried to have him removed from the army. And he said one thing quietly to himself in the dark. Lord, please help me get just one more. And then he started crawling. To understand what happened on that cliff, you have to go back, way back, to a small house in Lynchburg, Virginia in the 1920s, to a boy who was quiet, serious, and deeply devout, and to a single night in his own living room that he would carry for the rest of his life. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7th, 1919. He was raised in a Seventh-day Adventist household, the kind of home where faith wasn't a Sunday obligation, but the actual architecture of daily life. Grace before meals was a conversation with God, not a ritual. The Bible wasn't kept on a shelf. It was read, every day, by everyone. On the wall of the Doss family home hung a large framed illustration of the Ten Commandments, painted in careful, reverent lettering. Young Desmond used to look at it every morning. Thou shalt not kill. He wasn't old enough to parse theology. He didn't understand denominational doctrine or the history of pacifism or the philosophy of nonviolence. He just understood the words. And somewhere in that boy's mind, those 4 words settled like stones dropped into still water. But it wasn't the illustration on the wall that made those words permanent. It was a night in his own living room, and his father's hand around a pistol. William Doss was a complicated man, loving when sober, unpredictable when not. He had a drinking problem that his faith and his family could never fully contain. And one night, Desmond was 6 years old. William Doss got into a violent argument with his brother, with Desmond's uncle, and it escalated fast. Words gave way to shouting. Shouting gave way to something worse. William pulled a pistol. The 2 men grappled for it. The weapon swung between them, barrel pointing at one face, then the other. Something in that room cracked open, something that could not be unheard and could not be unseen. Young Desmond stood in the doorway and watched. He was 6 years old. Nobody died that night. His father and uncle were separated. The pistol was put away. The house went quiet in the way that houses go quiet after something terrible almost happens. But something had already happened to Desmond Doss. Something permanent. He made a decision standing in that doorway. Not out loud, not with drama or declaration. Just a quiet, internal, absolute certainty. He would never be the man holding that gun. Not for any reason. Not for any cause. Not under any pressure. Never. He was 6 years old, and that decision was already made, already finished, already unbreakable. 25 years later, That decision would take him to a 400-foot cliff in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in the dark with a Japanese army trying to kill him. He grew up in Lynchburg, a good student, a diligent worker, a boy who took his faith seriously without wearing it like armor. And in his late teens, at a Seventh-day Adventist church service, he met Dorothy Schutte. Dorothy was warm, quiet, and devout. She understood Desmond in a way that few people outside his own family ever had, not despite his beliefs, but because of them. Their courtship was slow and earnest. Sunday visits, church picnics, evenings on the porch. Old-fashioned, even by the standards of the late 1930s. He loved her in the complete, uncomplicated way of a man who has very clear ideas about what matters. By December of 1941, they were engaged. And then Pearl Harbor happened. At the time, Desmond was working at a shipyard in Newport News, Virginia. War production, critical infrastructure. His job classified him as essential to the national defense effort, which meant he was legally exempt from the draft. He could have sat out the war entirely. He had every right to. Dorothy certainly hoped he would. He enlisted anyway. He would not carry a rifle. He would not fire a weapon. He would not take a life. But he believed in his country, fiercely, genuinely, without contradiction. And he believed that if young men were going to be sent into battle, someone needed to go with them whose only job was to bring them back. He signed up as a combat medic. The night before he shipped out to basic training, Dorothy pressed a small, thin Bible into his hands. Pocket-sized, small enough to sit flat against his chest. She had held it a long time before giving it to him. He carried it through the entire war. He read from it every single morning, in barracks, in foxholes, in the rain, in the smoke, in the moments before the shooting started. Every morning, without exception, the Bible, the prayer, and then the work. The 77th Infantry Division, the Statue of Liberty Division, received Private Desmond Doss into its ranks in 1942, and the welcome was not warm. From the very first day of training, the mockery began. They called him the preacher. They called him coward. They said the phrase conscientious objector, the way you say something you've scraped off the bottom of a boot. To the men of the 77th, a CO was not a man of principle. He was a man who wanted the protection of the uniform without the courage, or the basic decency, to carry a weapon. A man who planned to let other men die for him while he hid behind his Bible and his God. At night, when Desmond knelt beside his bunk to pray, men threw boots at him. He didn't retaliate. He didn't file a complaint. He picked up the boots and went to sleep. But the hostility didn't stay at the level of boots and insults. It escalated. It went official. Then something happened that changed the entire situation. Sergeant Howell filed formal paperwork to have Desmond Doss removed from the unit. Called him a liability. Said a man who refused to fight was a danger to every soldier around him. That his refusal to carry a weapon would get good men killed. Captain Jack Glover went further. He filed paperwork labeling Doss a Section 8, military language for a psychiatric case, mentally unfit to serve. Glover wasn't being cruel for cruelty's sake. He genuinely believed that a man who walked into combat without a weapon was either dangerously naive or dangerously unstable. He wanted Doss gone. And then came a threat that had nothing to do with paperwork. One soldier looked Desmond Doss directly in the eyes, in the barracks, in front of other men, and said, with no ambiguity, no humor, and no room for misinterpretation, "Doss, if we ever get into combat, I will kill you myself." A lesser man, or a smarter man, depending on your perspective, would have accepted the discharge. Quietly, without drama, disappeared back to Virginia, back to Dorothy, back to a civilian life that he had every legal right to live. Desmond Doss did not accept the discharge. He fought back, not with fists, not with anger, with military law. He knew the Selective Training and Service Act. He knew his rights as a conscientious objector under the military code. He knew the Army could not force a man to carry a weapon or perform combatant duties if that man's religious beliefs genuinely prohibited it, and his genuinely did. He made sure his commanding officers understood this, in writing, through channels, with the kind of quiet and methodical persistence that drove Sergeant Howell and Captain Glover absolutely mad. He filed his paperwork. He appealed. He waited. He won. The Army kept him. No rifle, no bayonet, no sidearm, just a medic kit, a pocket Bible, and an identity so solid you could have used it as a foundation stone. The men who had tried to destroy him were now going into combat with him, whether they liked it or not. They did not like it. The 77th Infantry Division shipped out in 1944. First stop, Guam. Guam had been held by Japan since 1941, seized in the desperate opening weeks of the Pacific War. Taking it back required weeks of grinding combat through jungle, stone, and heat, the kind of fighting where distance is measured in feet and every shadow might be armed. In the middle of it all, crawling through the same jungle, under the same fire, toward the same wounded men, was Desmond Doss. With no weapon, he ran toward gunfire. He stabilized men under direct fire. He dragged soldiers to cover across open ground, alone, sometimes with bullets cutting the air around him. He was shot at constantly. He was nearly killed multiple times in Guam alone. He was not hit, not once. There was also the matter of the Sabbath. Seventh-day Adventists observe the Sabbath on Saturday, sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, and Desmond Doss refused to perform combatant duties on the Sabbath. This created yet another layer of friction with his commanders. His solution was characteristically practical. He volunteered for any duty on Sunday that others would otherwise have to perform, and he treated wounded on Saturday without any hesitation whatsoever, because healing, in his understanding, was never a violation of anything God required. But the real change that happened in Guam was quieter than any of that. It happened slowly. It happened in the margins of the fighting, in the moments between engagements, in the looks men exchanged when they thought Desmond wasn't watching. They were noticing something. Wherever Desmond Doss went, men came back alive. Men who should have been left behind. Men who had stopped moving and were therefore invisible to everyone except this one unarmed medic who kept crawling toward the fire instead of away from it. The contempt didn't disappear overnight, but it got quieter, harder to sustain in the face of the evidence. After Guam came the Philippines. More combat, more heat, more men wounded in more ways than training could prepare you for. And through all of it, Desmond served, still unarmed, still reading his Bible every morning, still praying. And then something changed that nobody had predicted. Men started asking him to pray with them before they went into battle. The same men, the same unit, the same barracks full of soldiers who had once thrown boots at him while he knelt at his bunk. They started asking him to pray. And then came Okinawa. April 1945. Okinawa, the last island before Japan itself. Military planners in Washington had already begun calculating the cost of an invasion of the Japanese home islands. The estimates were staggering: 1 million American casualties, possibly more. Okinawa was the rehearsal for that invasion. It was the final exam. It was where the Pacific War would either break open or drag on for another 2 years of slaughter. The 77th Infantry Division was assigned to the Maeda Escarpment. The Americans called it Hacksaw Ridge. Stand at the base and look up. 400 feet of sheer limestone cliff, jagged and pale, rising straight out of the Okinawan Plateau like a wall built by something that didn't want you there. At the top, a plateau stretching back toward the Japanese interior, and on that plateau, tens of thousands of Imperial Japanese soldiers dug into tunnels and bunkers that had been carved into the rock over years. The Japanese commander had one order: hold. Hold until there was no one left to hold. His men had the same order. They meant it. The Americans went up. They were driven back. They went up again. They were driven back again. Soldiers called it a meat grinder, and the phrase was not metaphor. Machine gun positions swept the plateau in overlapping arcs with no dead ground to hide in. Mortar rounds came without warning. The soil at the top of the ridge was dark and wet with blood. The Americans sent men up, and the ridge sent pieces of them back. On the morning of the third major assault, the men of the 77th assembled at the base of the cliff. Exhausted, scared in the specific, muted way that men get scared when they've already seen what is waiting at the top and they're going up anyway. Desmond Doss was with them. He asked them to wait. He needed a few minutes to finish his morning Bible reading. Nobody complained. Nobody rushed him. Nobody said a word. These were the same men, some of the same men, who had thrown boots at him while he prayed in training camp, who had signed their names to paperwork calling him unfit to serve, who had threatened his life. Now they stood in the mud at the base of Hacksaw Ridge in silence and waited for Desmond Doss to finish reading his Bible. He closed it, tucked it into his breast pocket against his heart, looked up at the cliff. They went up. The assault went badly from the start. Japanese forces were waiting. They had prepared positions on every approach. The moment the Americans crested the ridge, the fire opened, machine guns in converging lines, mortars walking through the plateau, snipers picking at the edges. Men went down. Officers shouted orders over the noise. The ground at the top of Hacksaw Ridge offered almost nothing to hide behind. A shallow shell crater here, a fold in the earth there, and open killing ground everywhere else. Desmond moved through it, low, fast, crawling on his elbows, stopping at every fallen soldier to assess, breathing, bleeding, conscious, stabilizing them, doing what he could with what he had, and then moving to the next man. No weapon, just his hands, just his kit, just the certainty that his job was to keep as many of these men alive as the situation would allow. And then something happened that made his situation considerably worse. The Japanese had been ordered to kill the American medic. Specifically, by name, or rather, by description, the unarmed one. The one who kept crawling forward when everyone else was crawling back. The one who kept pulling wounded soldiers out of the fire. He was a tactical problem. He was reversing their work, and Japanese commanders had apparently decided he needed to be dealt with as a priority target. They were shooting at Desmond Doss with everything they had, and he was still crawling toward them. Then the Japanese counterattack came. Hard, fast, coordinated, the kind of assault that meant the Americans had run out of good options. The order came down the chain of command. Fall back. Every American soldier on Hacksaw Ridge heard it. They moved, carried what they could carry, left what they couldn't. Men scrambled for the cliff's edge, for the ropes and cargo nets, for the 400-foot descent to the ground below. It was controlled chaos. It was survival. Desmond Doss stood in the middle of it and looked around. There were men who couldn't be moved, men who were unconscious, men whose wounds were bad enough that no one had been able to get them to the edge before the order came. Men who would die on that plateau before morning if they were left there. The last American soldier went over the edge of the cliff. Desmond Doss was still at the top. He made a decision. He was going to stay. The plateau went quiet the way battlefields go quiet between the killing. Not safe, just paused. Japanese soldiers moved through the dark nearby. Voices distant. Boots on rock. The occasional crack of a rifle at something or someone at the cliff's edge. Desmond Doss began to crawl. He reached the first shape he could make out in the dark. A man, barely breathing, a wound in his side that had soaked his shirt dark. Desmond assessed it with his hands in the darkness. He did what he could. He stabilized him. He looked around for rope. He had brought rope. What he did next has no formal name in any training manual, because there is no training manual that covers this situation. He fashioned a rope sling, a system of loops and knots worked out in the dark, improvised with his own hands, without help and without light. A double bowline configuration, something he had perhaps considered abstractly, perhaps never at all. He worked the knot until it held, until he was certain it would hold the weight of a man. He dragged the first man to the edge of the cliff, and he began to lower him down. 400 feet, a rope, a knot he had tied alone in the dark on the edge of a cliff while the Japanese army tried to find him. The knot held. At the bottom, hands reached up for below. Soldiers who had retreated looked up at the cliff face, and in the dark, they could see a shape descending, alive, breathing, lowered carefully, one controlled foot at a time. They grabbed him. They pulled him in. Nobody at the bottom could see who was up there. Nobody could quite believe that someone was still up there. Desmond Doss turned around and crawled back into the dark. Lord, please help me get just one more. He found another man. He lowered him down. Then he went back. Just one more. He went back again. At some point during those hours, Japanese soldiers passed within feet of where Desmond Doss lay pressed against the earth. How he was not found is something that cannot be explained by any tactical analysis. He was one man, alone, on a plateau held by tens of thousands of enemy soldiers who had been specifically told to kill him. He had no camouflage beyond darkness, no weapon, no backup. He kept going. One man, then another, then another. No one at the bottom of the cliff knew what was happening up there. They only knew that men kept appearing at the edge, alive, breathing, being lowered down by someone invisible in the dark above. Someone who was not coming down himself. Hours passed. The darkness deepened and then began to thin. He had already searched the entire plateau once. He crawled back through areas he had already covered and found men he had missed, still alive, hidden behind bodies or in shallow depressions in the rock, still breathing, barely, just one more. The sky began to go that cold, pale blue of the last hour before dawn. Desmond Doss had been alone at the top of Hacksaw Ridge for 12 hours. He lowered the last man down. He sat for a moment at the edge of the cliff, looked back across the plateau. Nothing moved. The dead were there, as the dead always are. The living were gone. He found a rope, tied it around himself, and climbed down the face of the cliff. At the bottom, the men of the 77th Infantry Division were waiting. The men who had mocked him. The men who had thrown boots. The men who had called him a coward, a lunatic, a liability, a psychiatric case. He had lowered 75 of them to safety. 75 men. His own citation would say 75. Doss himself, in interviews for the rest of his life, would only say maybe 50, deflecting, minimizing, redirecting credit to God and to the men themselves. Military historians have placed the real number somewhere between 50 and 100. The number almost doesn't matter. What matters is one man, alone, unarmed, on a cliff in the dark for 12 hours, saying the same prayer 75 times over, and meaning it every single time. The battle for Okinawa was not over. Desmond Doss continued to serve. Day after day, in the continuing meat grinder of that campaign, he moved through fire to reach the wounded, still unarmed, still reading his Bible in the mornings. The men of the 77th had stopped questioning it. They had stopped questioning him. And then came the grenade. It landed close, in a cluster of American soldiers near Desmond's position. He acted on reflex. He lunged toward it, tried to kick it away from the group to redirect the blast. The grenade detonated before he could move it far enough. 17 fragments of metal tore into both of his legs. He went down hard, and then he did something that has no medical explanation and no rational justification. He told the men around him to help the others first. He treated wounded soldiers around him, men hit by the same blast, men hit by the fire that followed, while 17 pieces of shrapnel sat in his own legs and his own blood soaked into the Okinawan dirt. He worked on other men for 5 hours before he allowed anyone to touch his wounds. 5 hours, with 17 pieces of metal in his legs, treating other men. When they finally got him onto a stretcher, when the litter bearers finally lifted him and began moving toward the rear, Desmond Doss saw a soldier nearby who was more critically wounded than he was. He rolled off the stretcher. He told the litter bearers to take the other man. He would manage. He began crawling towards safety on his own, shrapnel in both legs, bleeding, moving on his hands and elbows across the ground, the way he had crawled across that plateau all night toward men who needed him. A Japanese sniper found him. The bullet hit him in the arm, his left arm. It tore through the flesh and left him one functioning arm on a man who was already moving on hands and knees with shrapnel in both legs. He stopped crawling. He assessed the wound, clinically, methodically, the way he had assessed hundreds of other men's wounds. He found a rifle on the ground, someone's abandoned weapon. He used a rifle, but as a splint. Someone else's rifle. He still would not fire it. He never touched the trigger. He lashed it to his arm as a brace and kept crawling. He crawled 300 yards to safety. Alone. October 12, 1945. The East Room of the White House. Washington, D.C. President Harry S. Truman, a man who had dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, who had made harder decisions than almost any other human being alive in 1945, placed the Medal of Honor around the neck of Corporal Desmond Thomas Doss, the first conscientious objector in American history to receive his country's highest military decoration. Truman looked at the thin, quiet man standing before him. This Seventh-day Adventist from Lynchburg, Virginia, who had walked into the worst war in human history with nothing but a medikit and a pocket Bible, who had refused to fire a weapon under any circumstance, who had nonetheless saved more lives at Hacksaw Ridge than any other single individual in that campaign. Truman looked at him and said something that surprised everyone in the room. "I would rather have this medal than be president." Captain Jack Glover was there. The same Captain Jack Glover who had filed the paperwork to have Desmond Doss removed from the Army as a psychiatric case. The same Captain Glover who had called him a Section 8. The same man who had decided, with the full force of his authority, that this quiet medic from Virginia was a danger and a liability and should be someone else's problem. Glover publicly stated that Desmond Doss was the bravest man he had ever known in his life. He said that he owed his life to Desmond Doss. He said these things in front of other people, in print, on record, without qualification. The army that had tried to expel him was now giving him its highest honor. The officers who had fought to remove him were now speaking his name with something that sounded a great deal like reverence. And Desmond Doss stood there and thanked them, quietly, without irony, without bitterness. But the price of those years was written on his body in ways that the ceremony could not erase. He came home from the Pacific with tuberculosis, contracted during his service, embedded in his lungs by the time the war ended. The disease took one lung entirely. It took 5 of his ribs. He spent nearly 5 years in military hospitals after the war. The man who had survived Japanese machine gun fire and grenade shrapnel and a sniper's bullet, now fighting his own body in a hospital bed. Dorothy was there through all of it. She always was. He never once complained. Not in any letter. Not in any interview. Not to any reporter, biographer, or a friend who spent time with him in those years. He said, consistently, that he had been privileged to serve. He said the way people say things that are completely true. He recovered, slowly, the mountains of North Georgia, then Alabama. He farmed. He went to church. He read his Bible every morning, just as he had read it in the barracks, in the foxholes, at the base of Hacksaw Ridge, while the men of the 77th stood in silence and waited. Dorothy died in 1991. He remarried. He continued to live quietly, in that specific, unhurried way of a man who has already been tested far beyond what most people can imagine, and who has come out knowing exactly who he is. In 2004, a documentary filmmaker came to find him. Desmond was 85 years old. He sat down in front of the camera, and he told the story, not as a hero would tell it, with ceremony and weight, but as a man tells a story he still can't quite believe, even though he was there. I didn't do anything special, he said. I just did what anyone should have done. In the years after the documentary, some of the men he had saved tracked him down. Not all of them. Many had already died, as men of that generation were dying by then. But some came. They came, mostly, without cameras or ceremony. They came just to stand in front of him. And some of them, combat veterans, men who had seen things that leave permanent marks on the inside of a person, stood in front of Desmond Doss and told him they were sorry. Sorry for the boots. Sorry for the names. Sorry for the threats. Sorry for being the kind of men who could look at someone like him and see a problem instead of person. Desmond Doss told them it was all right. He meant it. Desmond Thomas Doss died on March 23, 2006. He was 87 years old. He died in Piedmont, Alabama, in the quiet he had earned and chosen, not far from the mountains where he had spent so much of his long life. Before he died, a reporter asked him the question that everyone who heard his story eventually asked. What kept you going up there? Alone on that ridge in the dark for 12 hours? What kept you crawling back? He thought about it for a moment. And then he said, I just kept thinking, maybe there's one more. Some men go to war to prove they can kill. Desmond Doss went to prove something else entirely. He went to prove that a man could stand in the middle of the worst violence the 20th century produced, the fire, the darkness, the loneliness, the threat of death from every direction, including his own side, and come out the other end without ever becoming the thing he had been afraid of since he was 6 years old, standing in a doorway, watching his father hold a gun. He kept that promise through training camp, through mockery and boot throwing and death threats and official military paperwork, through Guam and the Philippines and the ridges of Okinawa, through 12 hours alone on a cliff in the dark with the Japanese army, looking for him specifically. He kept his promise to himself. He kept his promise to God. He kept his promise to Dorothy. And without a single weapon, without a single bullet fired, without a single trigger pulled, Desmond Thomas Doss proved something that armies, generals, and governments have spent centuries trying to argue away. That the most dangerous thing on a battlefield is not always the man with the biggest weapon. Sometimes it is the man who decided, long before the shooting started, exactly who he was, and who refused, under every possible pressure, from every possible direction, to be anything else. If this story stayed with you, drop in the comments. Tell me who you want to hear about next. There are more stories like this one. Stories that history keeps in the margins. Stories the textbooks leave out. I'll keep finding them. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.